Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people should exercise caution when viewing this video. It contains images of deceased persons. The stories in this video focus on the many issues regarding the stolen generations, which may cause distress.
Kaya, Yokai. I'm Jim Morrison, Chairperson of the West Australian Stolen Generations Aboriginal Corporation. I would like to acknowledge the Whadjuk people of this land and pay respects to their elders past and present. We are commemorating our Sorry Day 2022 and we're here at Wellington Square where our magnificent Stolen Generations memorial site is. Sorry Day is the 26th of May, the anniversary of the Bring Them Home report, which was tabled back in 26th of May 1997. I would now like to show you a small film produced by the Healing Foundation which talks about Sorry Day and why we have Sorry Day.
This is the story of the Healing Foundation. It begins more than 60,000 years ago. It's a story of a nation and Australia's first people. The first Australians, a strong, proud people. A nation of many nations, many languages, cultures and traditions, connected by spirit and body to their families, land and ancestors. We lived and thrived as a culture and a society for thousands of years. And then, the tall ships came. Colonization is to send settlers to a place and establish political control over it by the separation, dismantling and eventual assimilation of any pre-existing cultural laws, practices and traditions into the new colonizing nation's empire. To create this new colony, lands were cleared, stations were built, and the traditional owners of the land were rounded up. In many cases across the country, these acts heartbreakingly separated families, tearing people from their traditional lands and cultural connections, disconnecting people from their very identity and purpose. Many children across consecutive generations were removed from their families due to government policies. These children are known as the Stolen Generations. The physical and mental trauma of these events is unimaginable, but for many, it was real and has created an onflowing legacy of sorrow and trauma to many people across every one of these generations. The effect of past day events that have present day impact is now known as intergenerational trauma. The gap that needs to be closed is across these generations. The gap is physical. The gap is emotional. The gap is different for every person and community in this story. And we are all in this story. As a nation, we are stronger together.
For the pain, suffering and hurt of these stolen generations, their descendants and for their families left behind, we say sorry.
This gap needs to be closed. Not from the outside in, but from the inside out. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people building communities and healing the trauma with the support of a nation will help to close this gap and preserve and celebrate our culture and our people. The Healing Foundation, supporting communities. Strong spirit, strong culture, strong people.
As we saw from the Healing Foundation video, intergenerational trauma is very much with us. I'd like to introduce you to Lorraine Pryor, who will talk about her intergenerational trauma as a result of her mother and her grandmother being removed.
I realised my elders had suffered a lot of trauma in the past. I didn't know how it affected them emotionally and mentally and physically. So to see them all drink alcohol was just a norm to me. Little did I know how much they were medicating themselves from the trauma that they had experienced in the stolen generation when they were taken away. And these days I see that another poison has come out, which is ice, and that's the next level of poison that's coming out to affect our Aboriginal culture and take away our souls and our spirits. The thing with me, I became addicted to drugs, and I was in addiction for 8 years. And when I hit rock bottom in my life, I realised I needed to be healed for my children. I connected back to my culture, and I started to learn about the histories of my ancestors, the history of my grandmother and my mother, because I used to say to myself, when I grow up and have kids, I don't want to be like my mother. But the thing was, I didn't understand the trauma that my mother went through and the disconnection that she had from her mother when she grew up. And when I started to understand why I never had a connection with my mother because of her not having her connection with her mother, I started to understand, and I started to realise I've got to put that behind me, because I can't use it as an excuse, because they really did suffer so badly back in the days of the stolen generation. Taken away from their parents and not being able to have that bond with their parents, not being loved or nurtured by their parents. It's very disheartening. So I take back for what I say about my mother, because I realise that I am affected by the stolen generation. Intergenerational trauma is real, and it has affected me. But now I am aware of the situation, and I really want to break the cycles now for the next generation. I will do anything to make it stop. I'll do anything to break cycles, to make it stop for the next generation. We need to educate our children. We need to educate the white society about the stolen generation and how it has made an impact on our lives, and that it has flown down and made a ripple effect down to my generation after all these years. So my passion is to build my own Aboriginal women's rehab for drugs and alcohol, because I know the effects of what this drug is going to do to my culture because of the stolen generation and how it's impacted on their lives. I'm so glad to come here today with my mother and my auntie and learn about the stolen generation more, learn about the missions. I'm so glad I'm here at Yokai today. Thank you.
I would now like to introduce you to Tony Hansen, himself a Stolen Generation person who's in his early 50s. He's a member of the Stolen Generations reference group from the Healing Foundation. Tony's going to put some more context around some of the data and some of the real issues facing West Australian Aboriginal Stolen Generation peoples.
In 1970, I was removed from my mother at the age of 3 and spent the next 15 years in an institution. I remember being removed, placed in a vehicle kidnapped and taken away with these strangers, and seeing my grandparents and my mother in the distance. It took me nearly 13 years before I actually got to see my mother again and my grandmother. By this time my grandfather had sadly passed away in the 70s. One of the things that I remember is that my grandmother came to the school and stole myself and my other cousin from the school grounds to take us to our grandfather's funeral. For the next 15 years of my life, I grew up with all these other strange children, wondering what we were doing in this location, growing up on this farm, growing up in this institution, formerly known as Carrolup Native Settlement, now known as Barrowbank Baptist Mission. So when I talk about myself and my identity, I talk about my connection to the mission, my connection to the mission children. They are my family. We are a profound group of children that grew up in these institutions, not just in WA, but right across the country. When I look at my family, I have three families: the mission kids, my mother's family, my father's family. And the mission kids are my first family and the most important family to me in my life. I share that knowledge with my own children, and wherever I go, telling my story and educating people and raising the awareness about us as stolen generation children growing up in institutions and sadly being physically abused, many sexually abused. Personally, it's like the eye of the needle, and I always say that I fell through the eye of the needle, and the eye of the needle isn't that big. And sadly, if I had my family standing next to me, my brothers and sisters, you'll see the trauma embedded in their lives today. My two sisters sadly passed away before they were 50, one committing suicide and the other one sadly passing away through alcohol. The impact of the forcible removal of children removed around 100,000 children right across this country of ours. So there's a large ripple effect. It's impacting on our communities. Sadly, Western Australia was one of the worst places. We had 100 more institutions. The practice of removing children continued right up until the late 1980s. In this state of WA, we have just over 6,000 survivors still alive today. The impact really was profound. There's 57% of adult Aboriginal people in this state today are connected to either the stolen generation or they are descendants of this removal policy.
Yokai, healing our spirit, the trademark for the West Australian Stolen Generation Aboriginal Corporation. Now that you have some information about what Sorry Day is, please join us on the 26th of May